just days before September 11th changed the world forever. Whitney Houston walked into a private rehearsal studio in New York, alone, unannounced, and searching for something she couldn't explain. There were no cameras, no audience, no headlines waiting. But inside that locked room, something happened that Whitney never spoke about publicly. A voice she wasn't expecting. A message that felt impossible to ignore, and a moment that left her in tears. Shaking her faith, her purpose, and the way she understood her own voice, what Whitney experienced in that rehearsal would take on a haunting new meaning just days later, when the world fell silent and people everywhere searched for comfort. In this video, you'll discover the secret rehearsal few people know about, the mysterious voice that answered Whitney's song, and how it quietly changed the way she saw her calling forever. If you're ready to hear a story about music, faith, and the moments that find us before history does, stay until the end. And if stories like this move you, subscribe and stay with us. It was early September 2001, the kind of late summer evening where New York still felt bright even after sunset. Whitney Houston wasn't scheduled to be seen anywhere. No interviews, no photos, no press. That was the point. A small rehearsal studio near the city had been booked under a different name. Inside, the lights were low, the piano was already warm, and the air smelled like old wood and dust, like a room that had held 1,000 songs. Whitney arrived quietly, hood up, head down, with only 2 people from her circle. She wasn't there to prove anything. She wasn't there for a comeback headline. She was there because something inside her was restless. "I just need to sing," she said softly as she stepped in. No cameras, no expectations. The band, tiny, trusted, nodded. The keyboard player asked what she wanted to run. Whitney looked at the mic stand like it was an old friend she didn't trust yet. "Something simple," she said. "Gospel, something that feels clean." They started with a gentle progression. Whitney didn't belt. She didn't perform. She tested the room, her breath, her control, the way her voice sat on the notes. The sound wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and honesty was what she needed. Between takes, she walked toward the back of the room where the shadows were thickest. There was a second door back there, usually locked, usually ignored. Tonight, it was slightly open. Whitney paused. "That door always open?" "No," one of the crew said. "We don't even use that room." Whitney stared at it. Something about it bothered her, like a whisper behind a wall. Then, before anyone could stop her, she walked over and pushed it wider. And that's when she heard it. Not a person speaking, a voice. Soft at first, like someone humming the melody she was rehearsing. Perfectly. Whitney froze. Her hand tightened around the mic. "Who's back there?" she called. No one answered, but the voice kept humming, and Whitney's eyes filled with tears. Whitney stood still, letting the silence swallow everything except that humming. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was almost tender, like the room itself was singing back to her. She turned toward the band. "Y'all hear that?" The keyboard player stopped playing. The guitarist lowered his hands. "I hear something," he admitted, uneasy. "Like a person." Whitney swallowed hard and stepped closer to the door. The humming shifted into words, barely there but unmistakable. A gospel line Whitney hadn't sung in years. A song her mother used to play in the house when Whitney was young. Before the fame, before the pressure, before the world called her the voice. Whitney's face changed, as if someone had struck a hidden nerve. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." She pushed the door fully open. The back room was empty. No furniture except a dusty chair. No equipment, no people. But the sound was there. And then just for a second it rose. Clearer, closer, like someone standing behind Whitney's shoulder, singing directly into her ear. Whitney's knees weakened. She grabbed the doorframe. Her lips trembled. "Mama?" The room answered with one final note. Soft, perfect, heartbreaking. Then nothing. Whitney stood in the doorway, shaking. One of her team rushed over. Whitney, you okay? She wiped her cheeks quickly, embarrassed that anyone saw her cry. I'm fine, she lied, voice thin. But she wasn't fine, because that voice didn't sound like a stranger. It didn't sound like a ghost story. It sounded like memory. Like home. Like the version of Whitney she kept losing and kept trying to find again. She walked back into the studio, face still wet, and lifted the mic with a new kind of seriousness. Run it again, she said. The band hesitated. Whitney's gaze was locked somewhere far away. No, she insisted. Run it again, right now. The music started. Whitney sang. Not for the room, not for the band, not for a comeback. She sang as if answering the voice that had just found her. And for the first time that night, her tone cracked open. Pure, raw, alive. When she finished the line, she lowered the mic slowly and whispered to nobody, I hear you. After the rehearsal ended, everyone tried to act normal. The band packed up quietly. The crew avoided Whitney's eyes, unsure whether to mention what they had heard. Whitney didn't speak much. She just sat near the piano, fingers tracing the edge of the keys like she was searching for something under the surface. Finally, when the last person stepped out, Whitney stayed behind, alone. She walked around the studio again, slow, deliberate, checking corners, peering into shadows, opening the back room door once more. Empty. No voice, no humming, just silence. Whitney exhaled, frustrated at herself for believing it. She turned back toward the piano. That's when she saw it. A small piece of paper placed neatly on the closed lid of the piano. It hadn't been there earlier. She would have noticed. Whitney stared at it for a long moment, like it might vanish if she blinked. Then she picked it up. No envelope, no signature. Just one sentence written in careful, elegant handwriting. Sing like you did before the world got loud. Whitney's breath caught. Her throat tightened. She turned the paper over. Nothing else. She looked around the empty room, suddenly uneasy. The studio felt colder now, like the air had shifted. Who's playing with me? She whispered. No answer. Whitney sat at the piano bench, paper trembling in her hand. Her eyes filled again, and this time she didn't fight it. The tears fell quietly, one after another, onto the note. Because the sentence didn't sound like a fan, it didn't sound like a prank. It sounded like someone who knew her. Someone who knew exactly what she'd lost. Whitney pressed the note to her chest. Before the world got loud, she whispered. Before everything. She thought of church, of choir robes, of her mother's strict lessons, of the way she used to sing for God, not for applause, of the way music used to feel safe. Whitney stood up and walked to the mic stand again, alone in the studio. She adjusted it to her height with a slow, careful motion, like a ritual. Then she sang a single line, soft, barely audible, not for practice, for prayer. When she finished, she stood still, listening, waiting, hoping the mysterious voice would return. It didn't, but the silence felt different now, less empty, more like a promise. Whitney folded the note and slipped it into her pocket as if it were a key. Then she turned off the lights and left the studio, locking the door behind her. Outside, the city kept moving. Whitney walked into the night carrying a message she didn't understand yet, but she would. Soon. The days that followed felt ordinary, until they didn't. Whitney went back to her routine. Calls, meetings, conversations that felt shallow compared to what she had experienced in that studio. The note stayed in her pocket. She touched it often without realizing, like a habit. Then came September 11th. News, smoke, sirens. Shock that turned the entire country into one long breath held too tightly. Everything stopped. Plans dissolved. The world became fragile overnight. Whitney watched the coverage in silence, stunned like everyone else. But something inside her reacted differently, not with confusion, but with recognition. Because the feeling in the air reminded her of the studio. That thick, unnatural stillness. That sense that something had shifted beyond control. She sat on the edge of her bed and pulled the note from her pocket. "Sing like you did before the world got loud." Whitney read it again and again as if the words were changing. She swallowed hard. "The world got loud," she whispered. "And now it's screaming." She thought of the mysterious humming, the soft gospel line, the voice that had sounded like home. She thought of how she had cried without understanding why. Now she understood. The world was hurting. People needed something deeper than news. They needed comfort. Whitney wasn't thinking about fame. She wasn't thinking about charts or critics. She was thinking about what her mother used to say when tragedy hit their neighborhood back in Newark. "Baby, when people can't speak, you sing for them." Whitney closed her eyes. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay. I hear you." She didn't know who left the note. She didn't know if the voice was real, imagined, spiritual, or something her heart created out of desperation. But she knew what it did. It pointed her back to purpose. And in the days that followed, while the world tried to make sense of the unimaginable, Whitney began reaching out, quietly, to churches, to friends, to musicians she trusted. Not for a performance, for a moment of healing. Because she couldn't stop thinking about the sentence in the note, and how it felt like a command not to be Whitney Houston the con. To be Whitney Houston the vessel. A week after 9/11, Whitney returned to that studio. Same entrance, same dim hallway, same smell of wood and dust. The room was colder now, as if grief had settled into the walls. This time she came alone. No team, no band, just her. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The silence was heavier than before. She placed the note on the piano lid like an offering, then walked to the center of the room. Whitney didn't warm up. She didn't test her voice. She simply closed her eyes and began to sing. Not a pop song, not a hit, a hymn. Her voice moved gently through the room, low at first, then steady, like a hand on someone's shoulder. She sang as if she were speaking to the city itself, to the families, to the fear, to the souls that felt shaken. And something incredible happened. In that same back corner, near the slightly open door, the humming returned, soft, harmonizing. Whitney's voice caught, but she didn't stop. She kept singing. Tears streamed down her face openly now, but she didn't wipe them. She let them fall as she sang, because the tears weren't weakness. They were release. The humming rose with her, surrounding her voice like a choir you couldn't see. Whitney lifted her chin, eyes still closed, and sang the final line with a trembling strength. When the last note faded, the humming faded too. Whitney stood in silence for a long time, breathing hard, hand pressed to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure who she was thanking. Then she walked to the piano and found something else. A second note folded, resting where the first had been. Her fingers shook as she opened it. "Now the world is quiet enough to hear your heart." Whitney covered her mouth and sobbed, quietly, respectfully, like grief deserves. She sat on the floor beside the piano, holding that note like it was alive. Because whatever had happened in that room wasn't about mystery anymore. It was about calling. That night, Whitney called her mother. Sissy answered on the second ring. "Nippy?" Whitney's voice was soft, broken, but calmer than it had been in a long time. "Mommy? I went back." Sissy paused. "Back where, baby?" "The studio," Whitney whispered. "And I heard it again. Sissy didn't rush her. She knew when to let silence do the work. Whitney continued, voice trembling. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's God, I don't know if it's my mind, but I heard a voice humming with me. And I found notes, like messages. Sissy's voice softened. What did they say? Whitney swallowed hard, then read the lines slowly, as if each word mattered. Sing like you did before the world got loud. And then, now the world is quiet enough to hear your heart. Sissy was silent for a beat. Then she said something that made Whitney cry all over again. Baby, Sissy whispered. That's not mystery. That's mercy. Whitney's breath hitched. Sissy continued, gentle but firm. God will always find a way to call you back to your gift when you start losing yourself. And sometimes, He uses memory. Whitney wiped her face. I miss who I was, Mommy. Sissy replied without hesitation. Then go get her. Whitney's voice broke. I'm trying. Sissy's tone grew warmer, almost like a lullaby. I know you are. And I'm proud of you, not for singing, for coming back to your heart. Whitney whispered. Do you think it's real? Sissy didn't laugh. She didn't dismiss it. She answered with faith. Real is whatever brings you closer to God and closer to yourself. Whitney held the phone with both hands trembling. Mommy, I don't want to waste my voice anymore. Sissy replied softly. Then don't. Use it to heal. That's what it's for. Whitney closed her eyes. I needed to hear that, she whispered. And I needed to say it, Sissy replied. The following morning, Whitney returned to the studio one final time. She didn't sing. She didn't even turn on the lights. She walked in slowly, as if entering a sacred space, and placed both notes on the piano. Then she took out a pen and wrote her own message, simple, direct, and honest. I'm coming back. She left it there, not for the world, for herself. Whitney stood in the center of the room and looked toward the back door where the humming had come from. The door was closed now. She didn't open it. Instead, she spoke quietly into the stillness. Thank you for reminding me. No voice answered, but Whitney felt something settle in her chest, something that felt like peace. As she walked out, she locked the door behind her and stood in the hallway for a moment, eyes closed, breathing. Outside, the city continued grieving. The world continued trying to understand how everything could change in one day. Whitney stepped into the sunlight with her shoulders a little straighter. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know how long healing would take. She didn't know how the world would remember her. But she knew one thing. Her voice was not just for entertainment. It was for comfort, for prayer, for truth. And somewhere in the quiet of that studio, a mystery had become a mission. Whitney touched her heart and whispered the final line, the one she would carry with her forever. Before the world got loud, I was already chosen.